The blood-red sun cast long shadows across the windswept plains of Wyoming Territory as Abigail Summers stood alone, shovel in hand, digging furiously in the hard, packed earth behind her small homestead. With each thrust of the blade into the resistant soil, she felt the weight of her past grow lighter. The year was 1878, and at 23, Abigail had already lived a lifetime of sorrow. "This ends tonight," she whispered, her voice carried away by the prairie wind. Sweat trickled down her neck despite the cooling evening air. The hole deepened as she worked, muscles straining against the physical labor. Finally satisfied with the depth, she reached for the wooden box at her feet, a simple pine container that held everything she couldn't bear to face anymore. Her fingers trembled as she placed it in the earth. Inside lay the remnants of her former life. Letters, a tarnished wedding band, and a small daguerreotype of a man whose face she'd once memorized. The man who had promised her the world and left her with nothing but scars. "Goodbye, Thomas," she murmured, before covering the box with dirt, tamping it down firmly with the back of the shovel. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to escape her past, and now she was burying it, hoping the Wyoming soil would keep her secrets. As darkness fell completely, Abigail returned to her humble cabin, unaware of the approaching rider silhouetted against the rising moon. Blake Garner pulled his hat lower against the wind, the leather reins loose in his calloused hands as his horse picked its careful way across the unfamiliar terrain. At 28, Blake had spent most of his adult life working cattle, his body hardened by years under the relentless western sun. The small homestead appeared on the horizon, a faint light glowing from its single window. He hadn't intended to stop for the night, but his gelding had thrown a shoe about 5 miles back, and continuing would risk laming the animal. Blake had walked alongside his mount for the past hour, searching for shelter. The Rockingham Ranch, where he was headed to start a new job, was still a day's ride away. As he approached the cabin, Blake noticed fresh dirt behind the structure. Curious, he guided his horse closer, but in the darkness, he couldn't make out what had been disturbed. Dismounting with a soft grunt, he approached the cabin and knocked firmly on the weathered door. Abigail froze at the sound, her heart racing. She hadn't had visitors since settling here 3 months ago. That was the point of choosing such an isolated location. Her fingers instinctively reached for the rifle propped against the wall. "Hello," a deep voice called. "I don't mean to disturb you, but my horse has thrown a shoe." "I'm looking for a place to shelter for the night." Hesitantly, Abigail approached the door, rifle in hand. "Who are you?" she called. "Name's Blake Garner, madam, on my way to the Rockingham. I can pay for lodging if you've got space." Abigail's mind raced. The Rockingham was owned by the Millers, a respectable family she'd met in town once. That lent some credibility to the stranger's story, but trust didn't come easily to her anymore. "Step back from the door," she instructed, then cracked it open, keeping the rifle visible. Blake raised his hands slightly when he saw the weapon. "I understand your caution, madam. A woman alone has every right to be careful." The light from her lantern illuminated his features' strong jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble, eyes the color of a summer sky, and a face weathered by outdoor work but not unkind. His clothes were dusty but decent, marking him as a working man rather than a drifter. "You can sleep in the barn," she decided. "There's a small stall you can use and hay for your horse, one night only." Relief washed over his face. "Much obliged, that's more than I was hoping for." Abigail nodded curtly. "The barn's around back, there's a pump for water." "I'll bring you some food shortly." Blake tipped his hat and led his limping horse toward the barn. As she closed the door, Abigail leaned against it, wondering if she'd made a mistake. But turning away a man who'd soon be working for the Millers could create unwanted questions, and questions were what she'd come here to avoid. She ladled stew into a bowl and sliced a piece of fresh bread she'd baked that morning. Balancing the simple meal on a wooden tray, she made her way to the barn, finding Blake removing the saddle from his horse. "This should hold you over till morning," she said, placing the tray on a hay bale. Blake straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Thank you kindly, Miss Summers." "Abigail Summers," she replied, not wanting to appear overly secretive. "Miss Summers." He nodded appreciatively. "You're quite away from neighbors out here." "That's by design, Mr. Garner." He studied her face in the lantern light, the wariness in her hazel eyes, the tension in her shoulders. "Well, I won't intrude on your solitude any longer than necessary. I'll be gone at first light. See that you are," she said, turning to leave. "Miss Summers," he called after her, causing her to pause. "I noticed some freshly turned earth out back. If you're planting a garden, you might want to wait another week or so. There's still a chance of frost at night." Abigail stiffened. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, before hurrying back to the cabin. Inside, she secured the door and sat heavily in her rocking chair. The stranger had noticed her digging. That meant nothing, she assured herself. People dug for many reasons: gardens, root cellars, fence posts. Still, it unsettled her to know her private moment had been observed, even from a distance. As morning light filtered through her window, Abigail had already been awake for hours. Sleep had eluded her, thoughts of the buried box and the stranger in her barn circling like restless wolves in her mind. She dressed quickly and began preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush, coffee, and the last of her bread. Against her better judgment, she made enough for two. Blake had risen before dawn, checking his horse's hoof and determining he'd need to find a blacksmith soon. He'd pumped fresh water and washed as best he could, wanting to leave his temporary lodging presentable. The sound of approaching footsteps made him turn. Abigail stood in the doorway, a tray in her hands. "Thought you might want something hot before you leave." "That's mighty kind," he said, genuinely surprised. "Most folks would be eager to see a stranger on his way." "Most folks don't live 20 miles from town," she replied pragmatically. "Even unfriendly neighbors are better than none when trouble comes." Blake accepted the tray with a small smile. "And what kind of trouble comes to a place like this, Miss Summers?" She met his eyes directly for the first time. "The kind people bring with them, Mr. Garner," he nodded slowly, understanding the warning in her words. "Well, I aim to bring none, just passing through as promised." Abigail watched as he ate, noting the respectful way he handled her dishes and the careful manner in which he wiped his mouth with a handkerchief rather than his sleeve. Not quite the rough cowhand she'd expected. "Your horse won't make it far on that hoof," she observed. Blake sighed. "I know. I'm hoping to wrap it well enough to get to the next homestead. The Rocking M is still a good day's ride." She hesitated, then said, "I have some tools. I'm no blacksmith, but I've removed and reset shoes before when necessary." His eyebrows rose in surprise. "You have?" "A woman alone needs to know how to do many things, Mr. Garner." There was a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "I don't doubt it," he said quickly. "And I'd be grateful for the help." They worked together in the barn, Abigail proving quite skilled at handling the horse and tools. Blake watched her confident movements, curious about this solitary woman with calloused hands and guarded eyes. "You've had horses before," he observed as she expertly filed the hoof. "My father raised them back east," she said, her focus on the work. "I grew up learning to care for them." "What brought you out here, if you don't mind my asking?" Abigail's hands stilled momentarily. "The same thing that brings most people west, a fresh start." Blake nodded, not pressing further. "Well, you picked beautiful country for it." They worked in silence for a while longer until Abigail had the shoe firmly in place. Blake tested the horse's step, smiling with satisfaction when the animal moved without discomfort. "That's fine work, Miss Summers. Please, let me compensate you for your time and the meal." "That's not necessary, I insist," he interrupted, reaching for his wallet. As he counted out a few coins, a sudden gust of wind swept through the barn door, carrying with it loose papers from his saddlebag. Blake lunged to catch them as they scattered across the dirt floor. Abigail bent to help, picking up what appeared to be a letter. Before handing it back, her eyes caught a familiar name at the bottom of the page. "Thomas Winters," she read aloud, blood draining from her face. Blake looked up, surprised. You know him, her hand trembled as she held the paper. Why do you have a letter from Thomas Winters? Blake frowned, taking the letter carefully from her shaking fingers. He's the foreman at the Rockingham, hired me last month when he was in Denver. He studied her face, noting her pallor. Miss Summers, are you all right? Abigail took a step back, her mind racing. Thomas was here in Wyoming, less than a day's ride away. The man she'd fled from, whose memory she'd literally buried just yesterday, was practically her neighbor. You need to leave, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Have I said something to offend you? No, just please go now. She turned abruptly, heading for the door. Blake followed, confusion evident on his face. Miss Summers, Abigail, whatever's wrong, perhaps I can help. She whirled around, eyes flashing. You've helped enough by bringing that man's name into my home. Please saddle your horse and leave my property. Before he could respond, she rushed back to the cabin, slamming the door behind her. Blake stood in the yard, perplexed and concerned by the dramatic shift in her demeanor. Slowly, he returned to the barn to gather his belongings, his mind working through what had just occurred. The connection was clear. Abigail Summers knew Thomas Winters, and not favorably. The freshly turned earth behind her cabin took on new meaning. What secrets had she buried there? Blake should have followed her wishes and ridden away. It was the proper thing to do, the respectful choice. Instead, he found himself walking toward the patch of disturbed soil, drawn by concern as much as curiosity. The earth was still loose, easy to move with his hands. Blake hesitated, knowing he was crossing a line, but something in Abigail's frightened expression compelled him forward. He dug carefully until his fingers struck wood. Pulling the small box from the ground, he brushed off the dirt and stared at it, conflicted. The cabin door flew open and Abigail emerged with her rifle. Put that down, she commanded, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Blake slowly placed the box on the ground. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. No, you shouldn't have. She approached cautiously, keeping the rifle trained on him. Back away from it, he complied, raising his hands. Abigail, I don't know what connection you have to Thomas Winters, but if he's caused you harm, you should know I've never actually met the man. We've only corresponded by mail. She retrieved the box without lowering her rifle. That makes no difference. You're going to work for him. You'll tell him about me. I won't, Blake promised. I don't know what's between you and I don't need to. But if you're hiding from him, perhaps taking a job at the Rockingham isn't the best decision I could make. Abigail's resolve wavered. What do you mean? I mean, I have options. I can find work elsewhere if Thomas Winters is the kind of man a woman needs to hide from. She lowered the rifle slightly. Why would you do that? You don't know me, Blake shrugged. I know enough to see you're afraid, and I've never been comfortable working for men who make women afraid. Tears welled unexpectedly in Abigail's eyes. She blinked them back furiously, refusing to show such weakness. This isn't your concern, Mr. Garner. Maybe not, he conceded. But I'm making it my concern. What's in the box, Abigail? She clutched it tighter against her chest. My past, one I don't care to revisit. Blake nodded slowly. Then I won't ask you to. But I will ask you to trust me enough to tell me if Thomas Winters is dangerous, because I'm due at his ranch tomorrow, and I'd like to know what I'm walking into. Abigail studied him, weighing her options. This stranger had dug up her carefully buried secrets, yet instead of judgment, he offered understanding. It had been so long since anyone had offered her anything without expecting something in return. Come inside, she finally said. This isn't a conversation for the yard. Inside the cabin, Abigail placed the box on the table but kept her hand protectively atop it. Blake sat across from her, hat in his hands, waiting patiently. Thomas Winters was my husband, she began, the words falling from her lips like stones. We married 3 years ago in Boston. He was charming, educated, from a good family. Everyone thought I was fortunate to catch his eye. Blake listened silently as she continued. 6 months into our marriage, his true nature emerged. He was controlling, then violent. Her fingers unconsciously touched a small scar at her temple. When I threatened to leave, he told me no one would believe me. His family had influence, you see. So you ran, Blake said softly. Abigail nodded. Last summer, I made my way west, changing my name back to my maiden name. I thought I'd gone far enough that he'd never find me. Her laugh was hollow. Yet here he is, practically my neighbor. Blake's jaw tightened. And that's what you buried. Proof of your marriage. She opened the box, revealing its contents. My wedding ring, letters he wrote during courtship, a photograph, evidence of a life I want to forget. Blake looked at the items, then at the woman across from him, her shoulders squared despite the weight she carried. You're not safe here, he said simply. I have nowhere else to go, Abigail replied. I used everything I had to buy this land. You could leave, sell the property, and start over again with even less. She shook her head firmly. No, I've rebuilt once. I won't do it again. Blake ran a hand through his hair, thinking, what if I took the job? Abigail stared at him. What? What if I went to the Rockingham as planned? I could keep an eye on Winters, make sure he never learns you're here. Why would you do that for me? Because no one deserves to live in fear, he said. And because I've seen what men like Thomas do to women they claim to love, my sister. He trailed off, his expression darkening. Let's just say I have my own reasons for disliking men who use their fists against those weaker than themselves. Abigail closed the box slowly. It's a risk. If he discovers your connection to me, he won't, Blake assured her. As far as Thomas knows, I'm just a hired hand from Denver who happened upon the Rockingham by chance. Our paths crossing was coincidence. She considered his offer, the unexpected lifeline extended by this stranger who had literally unearthed her secrets. And what do you want in return? Blake's expression softened. Not all bargains come with hidden costs, Miss Summers. Sometimes people just want to help. For the first time since he'd arrived, Abigail's smile reached her eyes. I haven't found that to be true very often, Mr. Garner. Then perhaps it's time your luck changed. By mid-morning, Blake was prepared to depart. They had agreed that he would take the job at the Rockingham, observe Thomas Winters, and report back to Abigail in 2 weeks' time. It was a tenuous plan built on a foundation of new and fragile trust. Remember, Abigail said as Blake mounted his horse, Thomas is clever, don't underestimate him. Blake nodded, settling his hat firmly on his head. I won't, and you remember to be careful in town. From what you've described, he frequents the general store and saloon regularly. I always am. She handed him a small package wrapped in cloth, some bread and jerky for the ride. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a brief moment of connection that left both slightly flustered. Thank you, Abigail, for everything. Just be safe, Blake, and thank you for understanding. As he rode away, Abigail couldn't help but wonder if she'd made another mistake in trusting this man. But something about Blake Garner's steady gaze and straightforward manner had broken through the walls she'd so carefully constructed. For the first time in months, she felt less alone. The Rockingham Ranch sprawled across 1,000 acres of prime Wyoming grazing land. Blake approached the main house with cautious anticipation, rehearsing his story and reminding himself to appear casual about his delayed arrival. A tall man with a neatly trimmed beard emerged from the barn, sizing Blake up with cool gray eyes. You must be Garner, he called. Expected you yesterday. Blake dismounted, extending his hand. Apologize for the delay, Mr. Winters. Horse threw a shoe about 20 miles back. Thomas Winters shook his hand firmly. Happens in this country. Terrain's rougher than what you're used to in Colorado, I expect. It is that, Blake agreed, studying the man before him. Thomas was well dressed for a ranch foreman, his clothes of better quality than most working men could afford. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, the bearing of a man from money, as Abigail had described. I'll show you to the bunkhouse, Thomas said. You'll be sharing with 5 other hands. We run 300 head of cattle here, plus about 50 horses we're breeding for the cavalry. Work starts at dawn, ends when the job's done. Blake followed, listening as Thomas outlined the ranch operations. Nothing in the man's demeanor suggested the violence Abigail had described, but Blake knew well how easily such men concealed their true nature in public. The bunkhouse was clean and well-maintained, a step above many Blake had stayed in over the years. The other hands were friendly enough, though clearly curious about the new arrival. By supper time, Blake had settled in and begun forming a picture of life at the Rockingham. Thomas Winters ran a tight operation. He was respected, even feared, by the men who worked under him. The ranch owner, Harold Miller, was elderly and increasingly absent, leaving Thomas to manage day-to-day affairs. It was a position of considerable power, and from what Blake could observe, Thomas wielded it effectively. Over the next several days, Blake worked diligently, earning approval from the senior hands and establishing himself as reliable. He watched Thomas carefully, noting the man's meticulous attention to detail and his occasional flashes of temper when things didn't meet his standards. Those moments, though brief, revealed glimpses of the man Abigail feared, cold anger simmering beneath a controlled exterior. On Saturday evening, most of the hands rode into town for their weekly recreation. Blake joined them, partly to maintain appearances and partly to gather information. The town of Silver Creek was small but growing, with a general store, 2 saloons, a hotel, and assorted businesses serving the surrounding ranches. Blake separated from the others once they reached town, claiming he wanted to send a letter. Instead, he observed which establishments Thomas frequented, noting the deference shown to him by locals. Thomas spent most of the evening in the nicer of the 2 saloons, drinking moderately and engaging in what appeared to be business discussions with several well-dressed men. When Blake returned to the ranch the next morning, he carried valuable intelligence and a growing concern for Abigail. Thomas Winters was clearly established and respected in the community. If Abigail were discovered, her word against his would carry little weight. The following Saturday, Blake made an excuse about checking on a herd in the far pasture and instead rode to Abigail's homestead. He approached cautiously, uncertain of his welcome despite their arrangement. Abigail was in the small corral beside her barn, working with a young mare when he arrived. Her face registered surprise, then relief when she recognized him. "You're early," she said, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached the fence. "I wasn't expecting you for another few days." Blake dismounted, leading his horse to the water trough. "I found an opportunity to slip away." "Thought it best to take it," she nodded, studying his face. "You've learned something?" "Enough to understand why you're afraid," he confirmed. "Thomas has positioned himself well here. The ranch owner is elderly, rarely present. The townspeople respect Thomas, and he's cultivating relationships with the banker and county officials." Abigail's face paled slightly. "He's establishing himself, just as he did in Boston, creating a network of influential connections." "Yes," Blake agreed. "And he visits town weekly, usually Saturday evenings at the Golden Nugget Saloon." "I'll avoid Saturdays then," she said practically. "What else?" Blake hesitated. "There's talk he may marry the banker's daughter, Emily Holcomb." A flicker of emotion crossed Abigail's face, not jealousy, Blake noted, but concern. "Does she seem happy about the prospect?" "She's young, maybe 19, seems flattered by his attention." Blake watched Abigail carefully. "Should I be worried for her?" Abigail turned away, busying herself with adjusting the mare's halter. "Thomas is selective about who sees his true nature. Emily's father has influence and money. Thomas won't risk showing anything but his charming side until he's secured his position." "As he did with you," she nodded slowly. "It wasn't until after our wedding, when he had legal control of my modest inheritance, that things changed." Her hands trembled slightly as she worked. By then, it was too late. Blake approached the fence, keeping his voice gentle. "It's not too late for Emily." Abigail turned to face him, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What would you have me do, Blake? March into town and announce to everyone that Thomas Winters beats his wives? With what proof?" "These." She pushed back her sleeve, revealing a thin, pale scar along her forearm. "Old wounds tell no tales that anyone wants to hear." There must be a way to warn her, to prevent. There isn't, Abigail interrupted firmly. Not without risking everything. Thomas would recognize me instantly, and then what? I'd be the estranged wife making wild accusations, while he's the respected foreman with the town's support. She shook her head. I can't help her without destroying myself. Blake understood her fear, but the thought of another woman walking blindly into Thomas's trap didn't sit well with him. There has to be another way. Abigail studied him curiously. You hardly know me, Blake Garner. Why does this matter so much to you? He met her gaze directly. Because my sister married a man like Thomas. No one believed her when she tried to tell us what was happening. By the time we understood the truth, it was too late. His jaw tightened at the memory. She died from his last beating 3 years ago. Abigail's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, Blake, I'm so sorry. The law did nothing. Said there wasn't enough evidence, it wasn't an accident. His voice was hard with suppressed rage. He's still free, remarried to another woman who has no idea what he's capable of. Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. That's why you offered to help me. It's not just kindness, it's redemption. Maybe, he acknowledged. Or maybe it's simply recognizing that some wrongs need to be made right, however possible. They stood in silence for a moment, connected by shared understanding of a particular kind of evil, the kind that hid behind respectable facades and charming smiles. Come inside, Abigail finally said. I've made stew, and we should talk more about what you've discovered. Over the meal, Blake provided more details about the Rocking M and Thomas's position there. In return, Abigail shared more of her history with Thomas, their courtship, the gradual isolation he imposed, the escalating violence that had finally driven her to flee. He was always careful, she explained. Never left marks where others might see. Always had explanations ready if questions were asked. I was clumsy, prone to accidents. Blake listened, anger building at the calculated cruelty she described. And no one suspected. His family knew, I think, but turned a blind eye. His father was cut from the same cloth. She pushed her empty bowl aside. That's what frightens me most about Emily Holcomb. Thomas learns from his mistakes. He'll be even more careful with her, more patient in establishing his control. Blake reached across the table, covering her hand with his. We'll find a way to stop him, Abigail. I promise you that. She stared at their joined hands, then slowly withdrew hers. Don't make promises you can't keep, Blake. Men like Thomas rarely face consequences for what they do. This one will, Blake said firmly, one way or another. As afternoon faded into evening, they outlined a careful plan. Blake would continue at the Rocking M, gathering information and watching for opportunities to undermine Thomas's position. Abigail would maintain her isolation, but prepare to leave if necessary. They would meet every 2 weeks, adjusting their strategy as needed. It was dark when Blake finally prepared to depart. Abigail walked him to his horse, a lantern lighting their way. Be careful, she warned. If Thomas suspects you're not what you seem, he won't, Blake assured her, mounting his horse. I know how to blend in. Abigail looked up at him, her face golden in the lantern light. Thank you, Blake, for believing me when so few would. Thank you for trusting me with your story, he replied. That took more courage than most would understand. He tipped his hat and rode into the night, his thoughts fixed on the woman behind him and the task ahead. Something had shifted between them today, a deepening of the fragile trust they'd established, perhaps even the first tendrils of something more. Blake pushed that thought aside. Abigail's safety came first. Anything else was a complication neither of them needed. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Blake worked diligently at the Rocking M, earning Thomas's grudging approval while watching for weaknesses to exploit. Every other Saturday, he found excuses to ride out alone, always taking circuitous routes to Abigail's homestead to ensure he wasn't followed. During these visits, they shared information and refined their plans, but they also began to share more of themselves. Blake told Abigail about his childhood in Missouri, his years driving cattle, the dreams he still harbored of someday owning land of his own. Abigail spoke of her life before Thomas, her love of horses, her education at a women's seminary in Massachusetts, her hopes of traveling west even before circumstances forced her hand. By early summer, their meetings had become something both looked forward to beyond their practical purpose. Blake found himself noticing things he might once have overlooked: the way Abigail's eyes crinkled when she truly smiled, how gracefully she moved when working with her horses, the quiet strength that had carried her through ordeals that would have broken many. For Abigail, Blake's visits became bright spots in her isolated existence. She found herself preparing special meals on the days he was due to arrive, taking extra care with her appearance in a way she hadn't bothered with in months. It unsettled her, this growing awareness, but she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her whenever she heard hoofbeats approaching her property. On a sweltering July afternoon, Blake arrived at Abigail's homestead with news that changed everything. "Thomas is planning to propose to Emily Holcomb at the Founders' Day dance next month," he reported as they sat on Abigail's porch. "He's already spoken to her father and received his blessing." Abigail set down her glass of lemonade, her expression troubled. That poor girl. She has no idea what awaits her. Blake leaned forward, his expression intent. "This might be our opportunity, Abigail, if we could find a way to expose Thomas before the engagement is announced." "How?" she asked skeptically. "My word against his would never be enough." "What if it wasn't just your word?" Blake said carefully. "What if we had proof? Something irrefutable that even Thomas's influence couldn't dismiss?" Abigail frowned. "What kind of proof?" "Your marriage certificate, for one." "Evidence that he's already married would certainly halt any engagement plans." Her laugh was bitter. "Thomas would simply claim I'm dead or that we divorced. Besides, the certificate is in Boston, along with any other legal documents that might help us." Blake considered this setback. "What about physical evidence? The scars you carry are old and could have come from anywhere," she interrupted. "No, Blake, there's no proof that would stand against Thomas's word in this community." They sat in frustrated silence, the buzzing of cicadas the only sound. Finally, Blake spoke again. "What if we created the evidence?" Abigail looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we caught him showing his true nature? If respected members of this community saw Thomas for who he really is, his carefully constructed reputation would crumble." She shook her head firmly. "No, whatever you're thinking, it's too dangerous. Hear me out," Blake insisted. "The Founders' Day dance brings everyone in the county together. If you attended, absolutely not." Abigail stood abruptly. "You want me to confront the man I fled from in public, surrounded by people who respect him. Have you lost your mind?" Blake rose to face her. "I wouldn't let anything happen to you, Abigail. We'd have a plan, people watching, protection in place." "No plan is foolproof," she argued. "And you're asking me to risk everything: my safety, my freedom, the life I've built here, on the chance we might expose Thomas for what he is." "I'm asking you to help save another woman from the hell you endured," Blake countered. "And yes, it carries risk. But sometimes we have to risk everything for what's right." Abigail turned away, arms wrapped tightly around herself. "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one who wears the scars." Blake approached slowly, placing gentle hands on her shoulders. "No, I don't. And I can't fully understand what you've suffered, but I do know that fear, when we give in to it, only grows stronger." She didn't pull away from his touch. "And courage, does that grow stronger too?" "It does," he said softly. "Especially when you're not facing things alone." Abigail turned to face him, their bodies close in the humid summer air. "I'm afraid, Blake, not just of Thomas, but of trusting again, of believing that good intentions lead to good outcomes." "I know." His hand moved to cup her cheek, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "And I won't push you into anything, but I will stand beside you, whatever you decide." Something shifted between them in that moment, a boundary crossed, a possibility acknowledged. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Blake lowered his head and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, over almost before it began, Abigail's eyes widened in surprise, not at the kiss itself, but at her response to it, the rush of warmth, the sudden certainty that this man was different from any she'd known before. Hesitantly, she raised her hand to his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Blake," she whispered, "I don't know if I can be what you deserve. I'm damaged in ways that may never heal." He shook his head. "You're the strongest person I've ever met, Abigail Summers." There's nothing damaged about courage and resilience. This time, she initiated the kiss, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as Blake responded with careful passion. When they finally parted, both were breathless and slightly dazed by the unexpected turn of events. "Well," Abigail said softly, "that certainly complicates things." Blake chuckled, resting his forehead against hers. "Life has a way of doing that." They spent the remainder of the afternoon discussing their feelings, acknowledging the challenges they faced, and eventually returning to the problem of Thomas Winters. By sunset, they had the outline of a plan risky, potentially dangerous, but with the possibility of finally freeing Abigail from her past while protecting Emily Holcomb's future. "If we're going to do this," Abigail said as Blake prepared to leave, "we need to be certain. Once we set this in motion, there's no turning back." Blake nodded solemnly. "I understand. Are you sure you're ready?" She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." He kissed her once more before mounting his horse. "That's my girl," he said softly, the pride in his voice warming her from within. As Blake rode back toward the rocking M, his mind raced with preparations and contingencies. Their plan relied on precise timing, cooperation from people they had yet to approach, and Abigail's courage in confronting the man who had nearly destroyed her. It was dangerous, possibly foolhardy, but it was also necessary. The next 2 weeks were consumed with careful arrangements. Blake made discreet inquiries about Sheriff James Porter, learning the man had a reputation for fairness and a particular dislike for domestic violence stemming from his own sister's experience. This made the sheriff a potential ally, though approaching him required caution. Blake also befriended the town's newspaper editor, Walter Chapman, a crusty veteran of the frontier press who valued truth above popularity, and had already published several editorials questioning Thomas Winters's growing influence in county affairs. Abigail, meanwhile, prepared herself mentally for public reappearance after months of isolation. She altered one of her dresses for the dance, practiced the story they had crafted, and fought against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her resolve. Each night, she removed the wooden box from its new hiding place beneath a floorboard and forced herself to confront its contents, not to torment herself, but to remind herself why this risk was necessary. 3 days before the Founders' Day dance, Blake arranged to meet Sheriff Porter under the pretext of reporting cattle rustling in the area. After establishing rapport, he carefully steered the conversation toward Thomas Winters. "Seems like a man with a bright future here," Blake remarked casually. "I hear he's courting the banker's daughter." Sheriff Porter's expression darkened slightly. "Winters is well regarded by many, though not all. Man like that, rising so quickly, tends to make both friends and enemies." "You sound skeptical, Sheriff." Porter studied Blake carefully before responding. "Let's just say I've seen men like Winters before. Charming in public, different behind closed doors, but without evidence, impressions aren't worth much." Blake leaned forward. "What if someone had evidence?" "Someone who knew Winters before he came to Wyoming." The sheriff's interest visibly sharpened. "I'd say that person should come forward if they're concerned about the welfare of others, even if coming forward put them at risk." "I protect those who seek justice in my county, Garner," Porter said firmly. "Remember that." It wasn't a commitment, but it was enough to proceed with the next phase of their plan. Blake left the sheriff's office cautiously optimistic, unaware that their conversation had been overheard by a young deputy who supplemented his meager salary by passing information to Thomas Winters. That evening, as Blake returned to the bunkhouse after chores, Thomas summoned him to the ranch office. Blake entered warily, noting the glass of whiskey in Thomas's hand and the cold calculation in his eyes. "Garner," Thomas said smoothly, "you've proven yourself a good hand these past months. Reliable, hardworking, the kind of man I like having around." "Thank you, sir," Blake replied, keeping his expression neutral, "which makes me curious about your visit to Sheriff Porter today." Thomas swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Particularly your interest in my personal affairs." Blake's mind raced, but his face betrayed nothing. "Just making conversation, Mr. Winters, getting to know the important folks in the county since I'm considering settling here permanently." Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Is that so? Well, allow me to offer some advice. In small communities like this, loyalty matters above all. Those who demonstrate it are rewarded, those who don't." He shrugged eloquently. "They tend to find the climate inhospitable." "I'll keep that in mind," Blake said evenly. "See that you do." Thomas set down his glass. "Oh, and Garner. Those weekend rides you've been taking. People talk. Especially when a man repeatedly visits a homestead belonging to a woman living alone." Blake's blood ran cold, but he maintained his composure. "Just helping a neighbor with some horse training, sir, nothing improper." "Of course," Thomas said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. "Just be mindful of appearances. A man in your position can't afford to have his judgment questioned." The threat was unmistakable. Blake nodded curtly and exited, his mind already adjusting their plans. Thomas was suspicious, which made everything more dangerous but also more urgent. They needed to move quickly before Thomas could act on his suspicions. Riding hard under cover of darkness, Blake reached Abigail's homestead near midnight. She opened the door at his urgent knock, alarm written across her face. "What's happened?" she asked, ushering him inside. Blake quickly recounted his conversation with Thomas. "He knows I've been visiting you. He doesn't know who you are yet, but it won't take much investigation to find out." Abigail paled. "Then it's over. He'll discover me before we can implement our plan." "Not necessarily," Blake countered. "We move up our timeline. The dance is in 3 days. Thomas will be focused on his proposal to Emily, not investigating a ranch hand's mysterious visits." "It's too risky," Abigail protested. "We haven't had time to fully prepare to speak with the sheriff properly. We don't have a choice anymore," Blake interrupted gently. "Thomas is already suspicious. If we wait, he'll find you and you'll have to run again." Abigail sank into a chair, the weight of the situation settling over her. "And if our plan fails?" Blake knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Then we leave together. Tonight, if necessary. I have savings enough to get us to California or Oregon." She looked at him in surprise. "You would leave everything behind, for me, in a heartbeat," he said without hesitation. "But I'd rather stay and fight if you're willing." Abigail stared into his eyes, searching for any sign of doubt or deceit. Finding none, she straightened her shoulders and nodded. "Then we fight. On our terms, not his." They spent the night refining their plan, accounting for Thomas's suspicions and the compressed timeline. By dawn, they had a strategy that, while risky, offered their best chance of success. Blake left with the rising sun, both of them aware that this might be their last peaceful moment together for some time. The next 2 days passed in a blur of careful preparation. Blake approached Walter Chapman with a carefully edited version of their situation, securing the newspaper editor's interest in a potential scandal involving one of the county's most prominent citizens. Meanwhile, Abigail practiced her part, fighting against the fear that threatened to consume her whenever she imagined facing Thomas again. On the day of the Founders' Day dance, Abigail dressed with trembling hands in the altered blue gown she'd prepared. She pinned her hair in an elegant style she hadn't worn since leaving Boston, applied a touch of rouge to her pale cheeks, and finally opened the wooden box one last time. From it, she removed her wedding ring, sliding it onto her finger as a visceral reminder of why she was taking this risk. Blake arrived at sunset, dressed in his best clothes, a dark suit that transformed him from ranch hand to gentleman. His eyes widened appreciatively when he saw Abigail. "You look beautiful," he said sincerely. "I feel like I'm going to be sick," she replied, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. He took her hands, noting their coldness. "We can still change our minds. Leave tonight, start fresh somewhere new." Abigail shook her head firmly. "No, Emily deserves better than the life I escaped. And I deserve to stop running from my past." She squeezed his hands. "Besides, I have something now I didn't have before." "What's that?" "Someone who believes in me," she said simply. Blake lifted her hand to his lips. "Always." They rode together in Abigail's small wagon, tension mounting as the lights of Silver Creek came into view. The town hall was festively decorated, lanterns illuminating the street and music spilling from open windows. Couples and families streamed toward the building, dressed in their finest attire for the annual celebration. Blake helped Abigail from the wagon, offering his arm. "Ready?" She took a deep breath, slipping her arm through his. "As I'll ever be." They entered the crowded hall to the lively strains of fiddle music. Couples danced in the center while others mingled along the edges, enjoying refreshments and conversation. Blake spotted Sheriff Porter near the punch bowl, Walter Chapman in a corner observing the festivities, and finally, Thomas Winters holding court near the stage with Emily Holcomb on his arm. The young woman was pretty in a conventional way, her expression adoring as she gazed up at Thomas. Abigail followed Blake's gaze, her breath catching at the sight of her husband. "He hasn't changed at all," she murmured. "Same practiced charm, same calculated smile." Blake squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Remember the plan. We approach gradually, let him see you from a distance first." They moved through the crowd, stopping to introduce themselves to various townspeople. Abigail used her maiden name, explaining she was new to the area, considering purchasing land near Silver Creek. Her trembling hands were the only outward sign of her fear as they slowly worked their way closer to Thomas's position. Finally, they reached a point where Thomas couldn't help but notice them. Blake felt the moment Thomas's gaze fell on Abigail, the sudden tensing of her arm, the sharp intake of breath from across the room. Looking up, Blake saw Thomas frozen in mid-sentence, his face a mask of shock quickly replaced by cold fury. Emily tugged at Thomas's sleeve, confused by his sudden distraction. Thomas composed himself with visible effort, murmuring something to her before excusing himself. As he moved purposefully through the crowd toward them, Blake positioned himself slightly in front of Abigail. "Well, well," Thomas said softly as he approached, his voice carrying only to their ears. "Abigail, what an unexpected surprise." Abigail straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "Hello, Thomas." His eyes flicked to Blake, recognition and understanding dawning. "Ah, so this is where you've been riding off to, Garner. I must say you have deplorable taste in women." "Better than in men," Blake replied evenly. Thomas's smile was chilling. "I suggest you both leave immediately before this becomes uncomfortable for everyone, particularly you, Abigail." "We're not going anywhere," Abigail said, her voice stronger than she felt. "In fact, I think it's time everyone knew the truth about Thomas Winters, the respected foreman of the Rockingham." Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "No one will believe a word from a hysterical woman who abandoned her husband. Think carefully about your next move, Abigail." Blake moved slightly, creating space between Thomas and Abigail. "I believe her, and so will others when they hear what you've done." Thomas's laugh was cold. "A ranch hand and a runaway wife, against my word in this community? You're delusional." As planned, Blake caught Walter Chapman's eye across the room, giving a subtle nod. The newspaper editor began moving toward them, notepad already in hand. "This doesn't have to become public," Blake said quietly. "You could simply leave. Take a job elsewhere, start fresh where no one knows your past. Just as you forced Abigail to do," he added pointedly. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "I don't respond well to threats, Garner." "It's not a threat," Abigail interjected. "It's a choice. Leave Emily alone and leave Silver Creek or face the consequences of your actions becoming known. Thomas's composure slipped, revealing the rage beneath. You worthless! He reached for Abigail's arm, fingers digging painfully into her flesh. Blake moved instantly, breaking Thomas's grip and stepping between them. That's enough. The commotion drew attention from nearby dancers. Emily approached uncertainly, confusion evident on her young face. Thomas, what's happening? Thomas turned to her, his expression transforming into one of concern. Nothing to worry about, my dear, just an unfortunate encounter with someone from my past. Abigail stepped forward, removing her glove to reveal her wedding ring. Emily, my name is Abigail Winters. I'm Thomas's wife. Emily's face drained of color. His wife, but that's impossible. Thomas told me he's never been married. I assure you it's quite possible, Abigail replied gently. We were married 3 years ago in Boston. I have the certificate and these. She pushed up her sleeve slightly, revealing one of her scars. By now, a small crowd had gathered, including Sheriff Porter and Walter Chapman. Thomas looked around, realizing the precariousness of his position. This woman is clearly disturbed, he announced loudly. My former wife died last year of pneumonia. This impostor is attempting to extort money from me, using a superficial resemblance to my late Abigail. Abigail's resolve wavered at the smoothness of his lie. This was exactly what she had feared. Thomas's word against hers, with nothing but old scars as evidence. But then Blake spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent hall. That's interesting, Winters, considering you told me just last month that you'd never been married. Which lie should we believe? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Thomas's face hardened. You're both liars. This is a conspiracy to ruin me, nothing more. Then you won't mind if I ask a few questions, Sheriff Porter interjected, stepping forward. Starting with why Mrs. Winters here bears scars consistent with abuse. Thomas's control finally slipped. She was clumsy, always falling, hurting herself. I tried to protect her from her own stupidity. The venom in his voice silenced the room. Emily backed away from him, her expression horrified. Abigail stood taller, strength flowing from the support surrounding her. I wasn't clumsy, Thomas. I was beaten, regularly and viciously, by a man who promised to love and honor me. She addressed the crowd directly now. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to prevent another woman from suffering as I did. Emily's father pushed through the crowd, placing a protective arm around his daughter. Is this true, Winters? Are you already married? Thomas looked around wildly, seeing his carefully constructed world crumbling. With a sudden movement, he lunged toward Abigail, but Blake was faster, intercepting him with a solid punch that sent Thomas staggering backward. Sheriff Porter stepped in quickly, restraining Thomas as Blake steadied Abigail. That's enough, the sheriff said firmly. Mr. Winters, you're coming with me until we sort this out. As the sheriff led a protesting Thomas away, Emily approached Abigail, her young face solemn. Thank you, she said simply. I almost made a terrible mistake. Abigail squeezed the girl's hand. You have nothing to thank me for. Just promise you'll be careful with your heart in the future. The crowd gradually dispersed, many casting sympathetic glances toward Abigail. Walter Chapman approached, notepad in hand, but Blake waved him off. Tomorrow, he said firmly. She's been through enough tonight. Outside in the cool night air, Abigail finally allowed her composure to crack. Tears streamed down her face as Blake held her, his arms providing the safety she'd longed for. It's over, he murmured into her hair. He can't hurt you anymore. She looked up at him, eyes shining with more than tears. Because of you. Because you believed me when no one else would. Blake shook his head. No, because of your courage. You faced your greatest fear tonight, Abigail. You saved yourself and Emily too. As they rode back to Abigail's homestead under a canopy of stars, a sense of possibility settled between them. The future, once so limited by fear, now stretched before them full of promise. Thomas would face consequences perhaps not as severe as he deserved, but enough to ensure he could never harm Abigail again. More importantly, his true nature was exposed, protecting other women from his charm and cruelty. The following weeks brought significant changes. Thomas was charged with fraud for his misrepresentations in Wyoming and eventually extradited to Massachusetts to face additional charges related to financial improprieties discovered during the investigation. Walter Chapman's detailed newspaper accounts ensured the truth was widely known, preventing Thomas from simply moving on to another unsuspecting community. Blake resigned from the Rockingham, using his savings to purchase a small parcel of land adjoining Abigail's property. Together, they began building a modest horse breeding operation, combining his ranching experience with her natural affinity for the animals. On a crisp October evening, as they sat on Abigail's porch watching the sunset, Blake finally asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Abigail," he began, taking her hand in his, "I know it hasn't been long, and I know you have every reason to be cautious about marriage, but I also know that I love you, your strength, your kindness, your resilience. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." She studied him in the fading light, this man who had unearthed her buried secrets and helped her plant new beginnings. "Are you proposing, Blake Garner?" "I believe I am," he said with a smile, "though I'll understand if you need time to consider." Abigail squeezed his hand. "I don't need time. I need you. Yes, I'll marry you not because I need a husband, but because I want a partner, someone I can trust, someone who sees me as I truly am." Blake gathered her into his arms, his kiss sealing their commitment to each other. As darkness fell over the Wyoming plains, Abigail felt the last of her buried fears dissolve, replaced by the certainty that some secrets, once unearthed, could lead to unexpected blessings. They married the following spring in a simple ceremony attended by their growing circle of friends. Sheriff Porter stood as Blake's best man, while Emily Holcomb, now courting a kind young shopkeeper, served as Abigail's maid of honor. The small homestead was transformed with wildflowers and ribbons, a celebration not just of their union but of Abigail's journey from victim to survivor. As Blake placed the ring on Abigail's finger, a new one, untainted by painful memories, he made a promise that went beyond the traditional vows. "I will never try to bury your past or pretend it didn't happen," he said softly, for her ears alone. "But I will help you build a future where those memories lose their power." Tears shimmered in Abigail's eyes as she replied, "And I promise to trust in that future, even when fear tells me to run. With you, I choose to stay and grow." 5 years later, their small horse breeding operation had flourished into one of the most respected in the territory. Their homestead had expanded to include a larger house, substantial barns, and sprawling paddocks where their prized horses grazed. But the most precious additions were their children, 4-year-old Sarah and 2-year-old James, who filled their lives with joy and purpose. On the anniversary of the day they met, Blake led Abigail to a special spot behind their home. There, where once she had buried her painful secrets in the dirt, now grew a thriving garden of wildflowers and herbs, a living testament to transformation and renewal. "Remember this place?" Blake asked, his arm around her waist. Abigail leaned against him, smiling. "How could I forget? You quite literally dug up my past and found my future," he added, kissing her temple. She turned in his arms, studying the face that had become as familiar to her as her own. "Do you ever regret it, getting involved in someone else's troubles, risking everything for a woman you barely knew?" Blake's answer was immediate and certain. "Not for a single moment. Some treasures are worth digging for, Abigail Garner, you taught me that." As their children called for them from the house, eager for promised stories before bedtime, Abigail took her husband's hand and walked toward the sound of laughter. The past was not forgotten. It had shaped her, strengthened her, but it no longer defined her. Instead, she lived fully in the present, in the love she had found with a man who had seen her buried pain and planted seeds of trust in its place. Together, they had cultivated something rare and precious. A love rooted in truth, nourished by respect, and blooming with endless possibility. And in the fertile soil of the Wyoming wilderness, their story continued to grow, a testament to the healing power of courage, compassion, and unwavering belief in new beginnings.